Georgia at Alabama was billed as being the game of September, and it delivered. Well, it delivered in the fourth quarter. Anyway, a thrilling finish in Tuscaloosa and a statement victory for Kalen DeBoer as he showed that, hey, maybe he runs the SEC in year one. Maybe it's not Kirby Smart, or is it Steve Sarkisian? Welcome into SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. We're going to be tackling a handful of true or false or fact or fiction scenarios on the pod today, however you want to call them. But first, John, I want to get your thoughts on the big game Saturday night that we saw in Tuscaloosa. I was there covering it. Former President Donald Trump was there for a couple quarters. Anyway, watching it by the time Trump got into his box suite, Alabama was already routing Georgia at that point, and I believe Trump had left by the time Georgia had mounted its rally and nearly stole a victory at Bryant-Denny. But I thought a clutch performance from Jalen Milroe, some big-time plays from Alabama's true freshmen, including Ryan Williams with just an unbelievable catch and run on the 75-yard game-winning touchdown pass. And Georgia just did not look like the Georgia we've come to expect until the fourth quarter. What were your thoughts, John? And who's the real Georgia? Is it the team we saw in the first three quarters, the team we saw in the fourth quarter, something in between?
Well, my first thought was about you being empathetic that I am. It's really tough on a columnist when you've got a deadline game like that, and it just goes back and forth because it was like three games in one. First, you've got Alabama blowouts, the greatest team of all time, humbling Georgia. Then you got the Georgia just making a game of it, and then finally you have Georgia actually looks like it's going to win. Then Alabama struck again. A lot of credit to Alabama, though. It's sometimes when you get up that fast in a big game, and it happens rarely, it really does. I remember one time, this many years ago, Steve Spurrier was coaching Florida. He was at Neyland Stadium, got up 35-0 in the first, I don't know, it was a little over 20 minutes. 35-0, then what do you do now? Do you run clock? He got out of his rhythm. His rhythm was just press the accelerator, score as much as you can, and keep on rolling. Ended up winning 35-29, but the score was not at all indicative of the game. So Alabama, I think when he got up 28-0, credit to Georgia for coming back. But when you get up that much that fast, it's just hard to maintain an edge. And I thought Alabama had trouble doing that. But then the way it came back after it's lost the lead, how many times have you seen teams, once they lose momentum, they never get it back? It's just, yeah, it's just a stampede the other way, and they can't corral it. But Alabama did that, and that was really clutch. And the other two takeaways I had from it, Kalen DeBoer couldn't be off to a better start at Alabama. If you're going to succeed Nick Saban, this is how you do it. He's unbeaten. He's already got Alabama number one. He's working on one of the top recruiting classes for 2025, and his greatest recruits already on board with Ryan Williams, wide receiver, 17-year-old guy that's just turning heads like few freshmen ever do. I mean, the guy at his rate, he'll be a Heisman candidate at the end of his freshman year.
Yeah, to your point on the column, John, I started working on a column that never saw the light of day at halftime while Alabama led 30-7. Of course, they got out to the 28-0 lead. They attacked on a safety. It's 30-7 at halftime. Really had a great column queued up for this Alabama route, and unfortunately I'll be the only person to ever read that column. Unless you want to see it, I can email it your way.
Email it to me. I've written a few of those. I'm not pleased with too many columns, all right, but I've done a couple of those on deadline, so hey, this is pretty good given the deadline, and pretty pleased with this. Oops, it's going up in flames. There it goes.
Yeah,
Just
scrap all
ashes
that.
now.
That's right.
Uh, yeah.
As far as the game itself, you mentioned impressive start to the SEC schedule for Kalen DeBoer. I mean, couldn't be going any better. And then for Jalen Milroe, I mean, some of the throws he was making on Saturday, just incredible. Looks like a different quarterback than we saw most of last season. And to be clear, he was not a bad quarterback last season. This was a guy that was getting Heisman votes last season. Got better as the season went along, but still, he wasn't making throws with consistency anyway, the way he was just putting it on a dime Saturday. I mean, some of those throws, Georgia's defense had no chance. That touchdown on the wheel route, one of the best throws I've ever seen a college quarterback make. Anytime I see, from the press box, you got that view from above, you see a guy out of the backfield running a wheel route, you just think, I know what's going to happen here. It's an incompletion waiting to happen. College quarterbacks can't hit the wheel route. And then Milroe just threw an absolute dart to the perfect spot on the field where only Jam Miller could catch it. And I mean, that wasn't all he did. He was running as good as ever and just torching a Georgia defense that I thought looked, quite frankly, a little bit soft throughout a good chunk of that game. And Alabama could do whatever it wanted. I was really impressed with the game plan of Kalen DeBoer. Thought he had Alabama more prepared than what Georgia was. I mean, make of that what you will. But it sort of did reroute the way I look at Georgia a little bit, because this wasn't a one-off. You go back now, and 7 of the last 8 quarters Georgia has played, including that game at Lexington, a narrow victory against Kentucky. Georgia hasn't looked very good. Now, they look great in the fourth quarter. As you say, it can be hard sometimes when you got that big lead to maintain it. Also, Georgia was kind of in grip it and rip it mode at that point. And Carson Beck made some really big completions during that rally. However, Carson Beck was intercepted 3 times in that game, and he was fortunate to not be intercepted 4 or 5 times in that game. There were a couple passes he threw that Alabama nearly picked off that could have helped cement that victory before needing the late touchdown. So I ask you again, who's the real Georgia here? Is it, Jekyll or Hyde? I forget who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. But in this Jekyll or Hyde scenario, who's the real Georgia? I mean, they look great against Clemson in the second half, look kind of pedestrian in the first half, come out and put Clemson away in the second half. Struggle against Kentucky, but we think, well, we've seen this from Georgia before. They typically don't win big at Kentucky. They'll bounce back. Well, they didn't bounce back. And so what's your perception of Georgia after this game?
Well, first of all, Mr. Hyde is the bad guy. Dr. Jekyll is a good citizen, saving lives out there. Mr. Hyde's out there giving him some patience. Maybe that's what it was really all about. Maybe that was a subplot. I look at Georgia, and I wasn't as, and we both last week, I think, picked Alabama. And part of that was, yes, Georgia struggled before against Kentucky, and particularly in Lexington, but that was more than a struggle. That was a just very nip and tuck game that Georgia prevailed finally by a point. To me, Georgia has not replaced its playmakers from last year. Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, who unfortunately for Georgia were hurt a lot in their final season. Carson Beck needs a little more help back there. There was a big drop early in that game on a deep ball. I'm not saying things would have turned out differently, but it might have at least postponed Alabama's momentum. So I thought what happened when Georgia got behind was that the Carson Beck there was really, in a way, there was no pressure. It looked kind of hopeless, and he's just started flinging the ball, and he's an incredibly accurate passer, and he was on target time and time again. But I look at Georgia, and I see a good quarterback who can bring out the best, and if he's got a nice supporting cast, receivers and so forth, you don't think of him as having to carry the load the way a Jalen Milroe does and can. But I don't know if he has that kind of help. Georgia's run blocking is not what it needs to be. Now, sometimes it takes a while for that to develop. I thought it did okay in pass protection, particularly late when it was making that comeback. But run blocking was not where it needs to be. And I think Georgia's got issues. Plus, it's got, as usual, some good defensive players, but I don't see that depth of talent across the board with Georgia's defense that I saw with its two national championship teams or even last season. So I've got real questions about Georgia. I'm not sure it can make the playoff because it's got games against Tennessee, Texas, and Ole Miss.
Wow. Yeah, we'll get into our true or false scenarios and revisit that playoff question here in a moment, John. But to follow up on your point about the playmakers, I think that's so true. Like Georgia doesn't have a Ryan Williams, the 17-year-old star wide receiver that Alabama has. I don't know that Georgia has a Jeremy Bernard, the transfer wide receiver that Kalen DeBoer brought with him, who also made some big time plays in that game. I mean, guys stepped up for Georgia second half against Clemson, but we really haven't seen those playmakers again. And that run game, you're right. I thought this Georgia run game would be very dependable with Trevor Etienne in the backfield, with a offensive line that I thought would be really solid. And they did give Carson Beck pass protection, but Alabama wasn't bringing a ton of exotic blitzes. They were sinking a lot of guys into coverage and saying we'll put more defenders out there, make it harder on Carson Beck to find the open man, and they sacrificed a little bit of pass rush. But yeah, there wasn't much ground game there for Georgia, and I think that is a lingering concern as well, because that was the case against Kentucky too. I mean, through the last 2 weeks, Georgia's averaging less than 3.5 yards per carry. So I think that is a lingering concern. Georgia hosts Auburn this week against a program that has all kinds of lingering concerns. We'll get to Auburn here later in the pod as well. So you mentioned it, John. Let's start with our true and false scenarios, and let's start with Georgia and the college football playoff. So they got one loss right now. They could absorb a second loss, I think, and still make the playoff at 10-2. But their schedule includes later in October a road game at Texas. I think Quinn Ewers will probably be back for that game, although Arch Manning playing well. In the meantime, Texas has not one good quarterback, but two. So they have a road game at Texas. They have a road game at Ole Miss, which Ole Miss showed some signs of concern in a loss to Kentucky, but probably still a playoff contender. And then they have a home game against Tennessee. If Georgia loses 2 out of those 3, I think they're probably out. They probably need to win at least 2 out of the 3, and I think that gets them to the playoff if they take care of business elsewhere. So true or false, Georgia will make the college football playoff?
Close call, but I'll go with false for the reasons you just said. I don't see Georgia beating Texas in Austin. And I think it's going to have a really hard time, against Tennessee. Even though that game's at Sanford Stadium, Tennessee has a great defensive front, a very deep defensive front, really like none other in college football right now. And I keep looking at that run game. The fact that Georgia, not only did it fail to block Alabama, it failed to block Kentucky. And that just raises a red flag because, again, Alabama, Jalen Milroe can be the run game and the pass game. Carson Beck is mobile, but he can't do what Jalen Milroe does. So I'll go it will not make the playoff.
That would be a huge development. I mean, Georgia coming into the season as the front runner. Ohio State was in the conversation as well, but Georgia's preseason number 1. Kirby was in position to have the throne of college football, particularly with Nick Saban retiring, Jim Harbaugh moving to the NFL. It's Kirby's world, right? And then if in year 1 of that world, he just hands it off to someone else. I mean, what a story that would be. And I'd like to push back on it here a little bit. I'm going to go true that they do make the playoff. I think they'll go 10-2, but I mean, I can't really make a a strong argument, a great stand for this, because I could see it going the other way, because of what you said with Tennessee. I think we assume, oh, that's a home game for Georgia, they'll be fine, but I'm not so sure about that, because, like you said, the way Tennessee's played this year, now granted they haven't faced a good offense, but Georgia hasn't looked like they had a good offense for 7 out of the last 8 quarters. So that makes me relook that game. I think the road game at Texas, I think Texas is in a much better place right now than Georgia. So is Georgia one of the 12 best teams in the country? Probably. Does that mean they're a playoff team? Not necessarily with this format. Although I do wonder, John, if they go 9-3 with, say, 3 close losses to Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, Greg Sankey's going to get out there with his Sesame Street routine again, telling everybody that one of these things is not like the other. Georgia's so good, just like he did with Alabama last year, playing in this conference that's unlike anybody else. And will the selection committee kowtow to Greg Sankey's demands once again, fearing that if they don't give him his way, he'll take his ball and go home and say, hey, you don't put the teams I want in the playoff? I'll go create my own playoff, and you guys can have fun over here in little kid land. So, I mean, I didn't have that scripted, John, but do you think there's a scenario in which Georgia could get in at 9-3 and the committee once again caves to Greg Sankey, or no, that's a reach too far?
I think it's a reach too far, because I don't think Sankey is going to be weighing Georgia against other SEC teams. I think there can be other SEC teams at 10-2. And how
Okay.
can he tout Georgia? How can he promote Georgia over other teams that might have a better record?
Yeah,
And
he might be busy stumping for 11-1 Missouri that has a loss
sure.
to Alabama. It's kind of a soft schedule, and he might be busy applying that Sesame Street argument to Missouri.
I really think with Georgia, Blake, what I do, and try to be aware of this during the course of a season, to not let my image of a program, my image of a team, impact what I'm seeing in real time.
Mm-hmm.
I think of Georgia as like the ultimate big game team. Well, it's lost its last 2 big games against Alabama for whatever reason. So I need to kind of look at that image I have, Georgia, and weigh it against what I'm seeing. I don't see that kind of team right now, and that's why I think it could lose 2 more games.
Kirby Smart said something that was fairly shocking, I thought, after that loss, John. And I know the frustration of defeat, the heat of the moment of a post-game press conference, coaches say some wonky things sometimes, and I think it's much more notable when they come back days later and say even wonkier things, as Hugh Freeze seems to do sometimes. So, I mean, I don't want to say this is the end-all be-all quote from Kirby, but it was fairly shocking when asked about his 1-6 all-time record against Alabama. I mean, Kirby's conquered pretty much everybody except Alabama. And now it's not just Nick Saban that's beat him; it's Kalen DeBoer. 1-6 all time against Alabama. Kirby was asked basically, "What gives, Kirby?" Kirby said, "Quote, what's everybody else's record against them? You know?" And he pointed out that 1-6 in 7 games against Alabama is pretty much what everybody else does. And I thought that was shocking, because it's like, well, Kirby, do you think your program's like everybody else? I mean, that's what you're saying when you say, well, what's everybody else's record against them, right? We're not doing any worse than anybody else. It's like, yeah, but you're not doing any better than anybody else against Alabama either. And it's just like Kirby has built his program to be different than the everybody else's of the world, right? And so again, maybe it was just the frustration of defeat, heat of the moment, post-game press conference after you lose a big game like that. I'm sure it's not very fun. Everybody just wants to get out. You're losing coach. You want to say a few words and get the heck out of there. But I was, my eyes got pretty big when I read that quote. I was actually on the Alabama side of things, but I read the quote from Kirby. Then I went and found the quote, because sometimes you got to hear it and watch it and think, like, did he really say this? It's like, no, I watched him say it then on replay. He really did say that. What's everybody else's record against them, just almost implying that like Georgia's in the rung of say a Texas A&M that's maybe beat Alabama once every 7 years or something. I thought that was pretty surprising for Kirby to kind of paint his program in that light, as if they're not really supposed to beat Alabama.
Well, I do think you're accurate in saying it was post game, still heat of battle. It's not a great time to be deeply philosophical, say something of tremendous impact that will resonate for the rest of the season. But when you take it on face value, it's as though we've all been saying Georgia's the new Alabama, and it's been the new Alabama for several years now because of Kirby Smart. And Kirby Smart is the coach in college football. And really already had surpassed Nick Saban, not overall, but just in those 2 seasons when he won back-to-back national championships. Kirby was the guy. So we're saying this all the time, Georgia's the new Alabama. And Kirby was saying, and so in some effect, well, we're not, it's not like we're Alabama or something. We've got a good program here, but hey, don't confuse us with Alabama. We've been confusing them with Alabama. But I don't believe he's thinking that way now. I'm sure he will use a loss as a motivational tool. He's a good motivator, always has been. But I can't imagine Nick Saban saying that even post game. He's not thinking along those lines. He's still thinking, well, I'm Nick Saban and you're not, and we're Alabama and you're not.
It's so true. When Alabama loses, I mean, the reaction, from their players are like, how in the world did that just happen? We're Alabama.
Yeah.
Nobody can beat us.
Yeah,
it's like, well, somebody just did, but it's a
we
total
just
180.
Yeah, it's just like that cliche that we hear so often. Well, yeah, we didn't play Alabama football. It's like, if we play the way we are, of course we win. Nobody can beat us. Don't be silly. We weren't Alabama today. We were somebody else.
True or false, John? Kirby's 1-6 record against Alabama diminishes your view of Kirby Smart. True or false?
False. What he's done there at Georgia, winning those back-to-back national titles, and I still think if not for injuries to Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey last season, and left them at less than 100% for the conference championship game, we're talking about winning 3 national titles in a row, and that's almost impossible to do. So he's done this. He came to Georgia in the middle of a Nick Saban Alabama dynasty and took his program to the top. And LSU was really good at times during that same period. So I give him tremendous credit for what he's done at Alabama. For what he's done at Georgia, he took that Alabama model, the one he was a part of as a defensive coordinator, and then put his own spin on it. He's a different kind of coach than Nick Saban. He can be, as I said, I think he's a great motivator, and he's got that. He's a gifted recruiter. And even though he's a defensive-minded guy, he's upgraded his offense. And I think sometimes I really thought it was significant the way he handled Stetson Bennett, the quarterback who led his program to 2 national titles. He didn't want Stetson Bennett to be the quarterback. He didn't think he was good enough. He had that image of a walk-on. Nonetheless, he looked at what was happening and said, well, I may not think he's the best guy, but that's just speculation. Look what he's doing. And so he stuck with Stetson and he won 2 national titles. So I don't think that detracts from what Kirby Smart has done, his record against Alabama.
Yeah, I think I share in your true or false evaluation there. I think I would lean false, but to play devil's advocate and push back on a couple things there, John. With the offense, I think you're right. The offense did thrive with Stetson Bennett, although I don't think the offense has looked the same since the departure of offensive coordinator Todd Monken. Mike Bobo, then Kirby hired on the heels of that, and I don't think it's been the same explosive unit in the way that it was while Monken was offensive coordinator. So it's kind of the classic debate of, well, did the coordinator make the coach, or did the coach make the coordinator, or did the quarterback make the coordinator? You can go round and round with that, but I think the bottom line is without Monken, this Georgia offense doesn't look quite as dazzling. And then two, while I agree with you that SEC championship game could have been gone the other way last year if Georgia had a healthy Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey, one of the national championships that Kirby did win could have gone the other way if not for injuries to Alabama receivers John Mechie and Jamison Williams. I mean, in the second half of that national championship game that Georgia and Kirby won against Alabama, Bryce Young's out there completing passes to Cameron Latu. The Alabama tight end became Bryce Young's top target in the second half there as they were trying to hold on to a lead. So Kirby's only beat Alabama one time, and I'm not convinced he beats them that one time if Alabama had healthy receivers, Jamison Williamson and John Mechie. So I hear you on the one side, but I think the argument could go the other way as well for the time that Kirby did beat Alabama.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. It's good that you pointed that out, because watching that game, I was thinking the game changed dramatically already. I think it was already without John Mechie. I couldn't think of his name yesterday when we were talking about it. So it loses Mechie, and then James Williams goes down in the first half. Once that happened, Alabama couldn't run the offense it wanted against that elite Georgia defense. It couldn't stretch the field, so Georgia could kind of tighten things up, move in a little bit closer, didn't have to worry about the deep ball, and that made all the difference in the world. But there was a time in that game when Williams was playing, I just thought Alabama's going to win this thing. So that's fair to point that out.
The bigger picture here, John, is you have Alabama and Texas kind of tussling for the top spot in the polls for whatever that's worth, and they don't play each other in the regular season. Now, they could meet in Atlanta in the SEC championship game, or Tennessee could get in the way of that when they host Alabama at Neyland Stadium later this month. Georgia could get off the mat, rally, get a spot in Atlanta. So true or false, John, Alabama and Texas are the SEC's two best teams. Not asking you if they're the two teams that'll make Atlanta, because schedule could factor in there. But do you think, true or false, Alabama and Texas are the SEC's two best teams?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because I think Tennessee's really good. So I just haven't seen it. It hasn't played in Alabama or Georgia or even in Ole Miss. It's beaten Oklahoma. So but I think based on what we saw last week and what we saw when Texas went into Ann Arbor and beat Michigan handily, really, they've done the most, and right at this point they are the two best teams. I'm not sure I'll be saying that later in the season, but right now I agree.
Okay. Moving past Alabama and Georgia, John, because there are other topics to get to. The other big narrative in the SEC last Saturday was Ole Miss going down at home to Kentucky. Kentucky, that defense that gave Georgia so much trouble, well, it gave Ole Miss a lot of trouble too. I thought Ole Miss really struggled to handle the physicality of Kentucky, and Kentucky's offense played keep away. I mean, they almost doubled up Ole Miss in time of possession. Now, to be fair, some breaks went in Kentucky's favor, and they made some of their own breaks as well, including going for 4th and 7 deep inside their own territory, and Brock Vandagriff hitting a deep pass that led to Kentucky's go-ahead touchdown in that game, despite Mark Stoops not going for a 4th down in the game against Georgia that Kentucky lost a couple weeks previously. He changed course and went as aggressive as possible. Went 3 for 3 in 4th downs against Ole Miss. I thought Lane Kiffin coached a little bit more conservatively than he normally does. Punted on a couple 4th and 2s while having a 1 possession lead in the 4th quarter. Trusted his defense, and that worked until it didn't. And then Ole Miss misses a game-tying field goal in the closing seconds. And so you look at Ole Miss's schedule, And we previously were saying, hey, this is a schedule tailor-made for a playoff run. But Ole Miss still has to play, well, they got to play at South Carolina this week, John. And I think people are sleeping on that game a little bit. We know Columbia, South Carolina can be a pretty underrated venue as far as pretty daunting on opposing teams. And South Carolina already in Columbia this year took LSU to the absolute brink. So first, Ole Miss has to get past LSU. They also, or excuse me, has to get past South Carolina. They also on the schedule have a game at LSU in October. They have Georgia on the schedule, and they have Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma hasn't looked great, but it's late in the season, and part of Oklahoma's problem has been they don't have anybody healthy on offense. So maybe by the time Ole Miss plays Oklahoma in November, Oklahoma could be a little bit healthier. Maybe that offense is a little bit more dynamic. So those are some of the games that sort of stand out on Ole Miss's schedule from here: South Carolina, Texas, Oklahoma, LSU. So true or false, Ole Miss will miss the playoff.
These are really hard questions.
I know.
Because I've been saying all along, Ole Miss I've been saying that since the end of last season, and a few more transfer portal guys moved to Oxford. But I can't shake that Kentucky game. So I'm going to say it will not make the playoff.
Okay, so true, Ole Miss is going to miss
Yeah.
the playoff. Do you share in my thought, John, that this one be kind of dangerous this week at South Carolina? I know we have a certain image maybe of South Carolina still lingering in our head from week one when they were very fortunate. I don't know about very fortunate. It is a much closer than we expected game against Old Dominion. But since then, South Carolina has been playing well. They stomped Kentucky on the road. Like I said, they pushed LSU to the brink. If Sellers, the quarterback, doesn't get hurt in that game, Lenore Sellers, that game could have wound up differently against LSU, and still they had a field goal attempt that would have taken it into overtime. Then they stomped Akron, which is sort of irrelevant. But now they have Ole Miss at home. I mean, this not necessarily predicting an Ole Miss loss, but it feels like this game is a game that's not getting a lot of attention, a lot of buzz, and this could be a haymaker on Ole Miss's playoff hopes.
Yeah, and the one thing that bothered me a bit with Ole Miss in the Kentucky game was it couldn't block.
Yeah.
Couldn't block Kentucky. I mean, Jackson Dart, who was playing about as well as any quarterback in the country in the first few games, was under duress the entire time against Kentucky. So Kentucky also, the defense came up against Georgia, but it beat South Carolina 31-6. So how much of that was Ole Miss just not having an edge, not being ready to go get it? I just don't. I don't see South Carolina winning that game, though. I think maybe if Ole Miss would have beaten Kentucky, it would be more vulnerable to South Carolina. I really think Ole Miss, with one loss, you're still in the running for the playoff, and so I think Ole Miss will come out and we'll see the best version of Ole Miss against South Carolina. However, the offensive line has got to play much better.
Mm-hmm. And South Carolina's strength, John, from what we've seen, is that defensive front. So
yes,
yeah, I don't that one I really think is flying below the radar. We'll pick it in the pick segment here in a few moments, John. But a few more true or false scenarios. Wrapping up on Ole Miss. If Ole Miss misses the playoff, let's say they go 9-3, 8-4, disappointing finish with the team that Lane Kiffin assembled here, how well they did in the portal. Let's say they miss the playoffs. Let's say Florida's in a coaching search, as we expect to happen at some point this fall. True or false? If the Rebels miss the playoffs, Lane Kiffin will be coaching at Florida next year.
True.
I assume you don't think Lane's going to leave a playoff team, so that's why I add that caveat of Ole Miss has to miss the playoff. I don't think he's going to walk away from a playoff team, although who knows. But I wanted to add that caveat in there. If they miss the playoff, true, you think Florida makes him the next coach of the Gators?
Yeah, I think it for Lane Kiffin. If he can't make the playoff this year too, he's got to be thinking, well, I've maybe gone as far as I can at Ole Miss.
Hmm.
I can remember this is another lifetime ago, but Bobby Bowden was a coach at Florida State. He was just getting that thing going really well, and his team was unbeaten. He went to Tiger Stadium against LSU, which was kind of a middling team, had a tough schedule, probably 5-2, 4-3 kind of record at the time. And Bobby Bowden told me later, he said LSU was also had a lame duck coach and was going to make a hire. And Bobby Bowden said that, I can't, if I would have lost that game, if I couldn't win that game at Florida State, then I might have gone as far as I can there. But
Mm.
he did win the game, and he went on to build a dynasty at Florida. But I do think that would cross Lane Kiffin's mind uh, if if I can't make the playoff with this team at Ole Miss, because this team on paper looks like a playoff team. But playoff teams aren't supposed to lose to Kentucky on their home field,
Right.
and Ole Miss did that. So yeah,
I agree with you, John. I think he would be tempted if Ole Miss made the playoffs and if Florida wants to make him the guy. Now, I don't know. We could debate whether that would be a smart choice for Kiffin. Ole Miss right now is functioning at a higher level than what Florida is. He'd have to flip the roster. He's shown he can do that, but he would have to flip the roster. He'd have to get NIL humming in a better place than what it's been at Florida. So there would be some significant challenges there. I don't know that he could reach a higher ceiling at Florida, but for a coach, when you have a season that doesn't live up to expectations, you can either look at yourself in the mirror and say, I failed, I'm a loser, I screwed up this year, or you can think, well, none of this was my fault. It was somebody else's fault. And I'm not just talking about Lane Kiffin here. This comment is not specific to Kiffin, but I will say about 90% of coaches that I've ever known, when they look at themselves in the mirror and have to admit that they failed, they're a loser, or it was somebody else's fault, 90% of the time, they're going to think it's somebody else's fault, and they would win bigger somewhere else if given the opportunity. So, yeah, that comment is not specific to Kiffin, but coaches in general, I think that way. And so, if this season doesn't go the way I think Kiffin hoped, you wonder what he's going to be thinking as he's looking in the mirror at the end of the season.
yeah, that's a coping mechanism. The last thing they want to think is, well, maybe I'm just not good enough.
No.
I don't think many coaches, even the worst, have ever thought that. No, they point the finger in a different direction. So I did all I could.
That's absolutely right. How about the winning coach of that game in Oxford, John? I mean, if Mark Stoops beats Florida for what would be the fourth consecutive time, they play later this year. That game is in the Swamp in October. Stoops has beat Florida three times in a row. He's beat them 4 times, period, in a series that never. You never even used to have to think about Kentucky winning that game. It was more, is Florida going to win by 20 points, 30 points, 40 points, or 50 points? Well, now Florida loses to Kentucky. Mark Stoops beats Lane Kiffin. True or false, Mark Stoops would be a better hire for Florida than Lane Kiffin.
False. Not even close. Mark Stoops has done a nice job at Kentucky. Not a great job, but a nice job. And there's no comparison between the two. He really, he's not what Florida's looking for. Florida doesn't just want to win. It wants to win with flair, the way it won with Steve Spurrier in the 90s, the way it won with Urban Meyer in the 2000s, where it's just vanquishing the opposition, running up huge point totals, and winning all of the big games and most of the rivalry games. So Mark Stoops, and I don't think that I don't. I would like to think Mark Stoops would have enough self awareness to know. I don't know if that would be a good fit for me because
I agree with everything you said except that last sentence, John. I think Mark Stoops is looking in that mirror in Kentucky thinking, if I were just somewhere else, think of how big I would win. I think Mark Stoops would crawl through every swamp, bog, marsh necessary to get down to Gainesville.
oh
But
oh no, I don't get me wrong. Excuse me, but yeah, he would take it. But
oh,
I
okay.
think once, yeah, he would take it. But once he got there, then it would dawn on him. Well, maybe
What
this
have I
wasn't the
just
best fit.
done?
Yeah, I kind of like going 6-6 and getting a pay raise for leading the mighty Wildcats to a bowl game.
Yeah.
6-6 gets you fired at Florida, even if you make a bowl.
I agree with you with your entire analysis there of Kiffin versus Stoops for Florida. I think Kiffin would be a much better choice for Florida than Stoops. I think Stoops could be a good choice for some other program out there somewhere. I'm not saying Kentucky's the only place he'd be a smart hire for, but we know that program, John. And it's like you said, they don't want to just win; they want to be entertained. And Steve Spurrier is still the standard at Florida. Still lives in Gainesville. He's got a restaurant there. Florida fans want the next Steve Spurrier. Lane Kiffin, despite this loss, I think is the closest thing we have going in college football today to Steve Spurrier. He's kind of a kindred spirit. He said 15 years ago when he was Tennessee's coach that he really admired Steve Spurrier, and he would be a fit for that job. The victim of the moment scenario would be, well, Kiffin can't beat Stoops. Just go hire Stoops. Well, Kiffin's beat Stoops before. It's not like he's never beat him. He lost this time, and that is a damaging loss. But big picture, he's taken Ole Miss to a higher stratosphere than Stoops has done at Kentucky. Kentucky under Stoops has undeniably been better than it can usually hope for. However, Ole Miss has done it at an even higher level. And we know Florida would need to flip that roster. They would need to get NIL going. We've seen Lane Kiffin do those things. He's flipped a roster. He's gotten NIL going at Ole Miss. So there again, I think he's a better choice for Florida. If it comes down to those two, I think for that particular job, I think Lane Kiffin would be a substantially better choice than Mark Stoops.
If Lane Kiffin could get the Florida job or the Florida State job, which would you recommend him to take?
That's a tough call because it's like, do you want to potentially be the big fish in the smaller pond? I mean, Florida State's not functioning that way this year. Or do you want to try to get back to being a pretty good sized fish in the biggest pond? I think I'd still, because of how uncertain Florida State's future is, I don't know what conference they're going to be in 3-5 years from now. And for me personally, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that uncertainty. What league are they playing in? Are they with the big boys? Are they with the small fries? You don't know. So I would say Florida, I think. Although, if you knew Florida State was going to be in the Big Ten a couple years from now, maybe I'd answer differently. But I don't know where they're going to be a couple years from now. And we've seen dysfunction at both places. I feel like because of the uncertainty with realignment and everything, I feel like there's a better chance that a good coach could come in and immediately calm the dysfunction at Florida faster than Florida State, because as a coach, you can't control what conference you're going to be headed to or playing in. So I think Lane Kiffin could calm the waters at Florida faster because there'd be more things within his control.
Yeah, that makes sense. And who knows, Florida State might end up in the SEC, so he would be going in the Southeastern Conference no matter what. But you can look at it and say Jimbo Fisher, Bobby Bowden had a dynasty there, as did Steve Spurrier at Florida, and then Jimbo Fisher also won a national title at Florida State. And then Florida State last year, unbeaten until it lost its quarterback, and maybe that team could have won the national title. So I don't think it's an easy call, but yeah, I'd probably go with you on that.
All right, last true or false before we pick some games here, John. Hugh Freeze is in a world of hurt at Auburn, and the next 3 games, John, road game at Georgia, road game at Missouri, road game at Kentucky. I'm not convinced they win any of those games. If they lose all 3, they'll be 2-6 in Hugh Freeze's second season. And we saw Auburn fire its last coach on Halloween of year 2. Now, Hugh Freeze
treat.
Yeah, trick or treat. Brian Arson turned into a pumpkin. Hugh Freeze is recruiting better substantially than Brian Harsin ever did there. However, in this brave new world of NIL, John, where boosters can just buy up the recruits, do you need the coach to maintain your recruiting class? Do you need the coach to the degree that you used to maintain your recruiting class? Or can you fire your coach and the boosters step in for a week and say, hey, we got this. Check's still coming, and a new coach is on the way. True or false, Does Hugh Freeze get fired this season?
False. And I think his recruiting track record right now really helps him in that regard. Um, I was watching that Auburn game Saturday, and Auburn's one of those teams right now that just finds ways to lose. I think it's a much more talented team than its record suggests. And that, of course, reflects on a coach. And Hugh Freeze hadn't helped things with his comments. Uh, However, I still think there are a lot of Auburn people that said they shouldn't have gotten rid of Gus Malzahn. I don't guess that many say, well, you shouldn't have gotten rid of Brian Hartson.
No.
But I think he gets another year. If he were not if he had the 45th ranked recruiting class for 2025 right now, his job would be in jeopardy. But I don't think Auburn would make a move on him this year.
If he starts to lose some commitments in the next few weeks, I think he's toast, because that is the only reason to give him a year 3. A week ago, John, I would have said I think Hugh Freeze gets through this season because I thought they'd get off the mat. I thought they'd beat Oklahoma. They didn't. They lost another game at home, and even bad Auburn teams usually win the majority of their games on the Plains. But Auburn's losing at home, and I think what you said has merit. That I think this team is more talented than its 2-3 record suggests, but I think that's a red flag about Hugh Freeze. And I look at these next 3 road games, and if Auburn's sitting at 2-6, I wonder if that recruiting class suffers a little bit in the ratings. You know, if he loses a few recruits and he's sitting at 2-6, at that point, I just don't know that there's a strong argument to keep in it. And if you think about the fan angst right now at 2-3, imagine if Auburn loses road games to Missouri and Kentucky and they're at 2-6. I mean, angst won't be a strong enough word to describe that fan base at that point. So I'm going to go actually true, John, that he's fired this season. However, if he beats Missouri and or Kentucky, I think he will survive. I'm just not convinced he wins a game in that stretch. And if they're sitting on 2-6 and he loses a couple commitments, I don't know. It's a tough call, but I think it goes with Hugh not making it through the season.
I guess the reason for my answer is I don't think he'll lose all those games.
Yeah, and that's fair. Yeah. All right, let's pick some games. John, we are still doing quite well, so I hope everyone listening is betting along to our advice here, because if so, you got some cashola in your pocket. I went just 2-3 last week, but I still got an 18-8 record for the season. You went 4-1 last week, John. You are 16-10 for the year, so we're both well above 500. I got a 2-game lead on you. We both hit our locks last week. We are just on a roll on our locks, so let's keep the good times going. Missouri, which, as I said, will have Auburn in a couple weeks, John, they got a big one Saturday. 11 a.m. Central Time kickoff at Texas A&M. I think this is where we find out if Missouri is contender or pretender for the college football playoff, because they got Alabama on the road later this year. Doesn't knock them out of the playoff by losing to Texas A&M, but I think it really, really hurts their chances. Whereas if they win this game, we have to start taking Missouri seriously for the playoff. Texas A&M is a 1.5-point home favorite. I'm taking Missouri, John. I've not been overwhelmed by either team, but Missouri's kind of got this way of winning ugly in the last year and a half. And I've kind of thought, like, at some point that's going to stop and law of averages kicks in. You don't always win your clunkers, but I don't know. Missouri keeps winning its clunkers. I haven't been particularly impressed by Texas A&M. I thought they were kind of fortunate to beat Arkansas last week. So I'm going Missouri on the road here, getting 1.5 points as a little cushion.
Yeah, I haven't been overly impressed with A&M, and I still don't know who their quarterback will be. Connor Wegman has a hurt shoulder. Will he come back and play? I'm not sure. But either way, this is the kind of game I normally pick A&M to win. because I'm always overrating the Aggies, as I've said many times. But I'm not going that way this time. Missouri has a better quarterback, and I'll take that advantage over having the home field one. Even though Cal Field it's great to have that kind of support, but they had that kind of support for the Notre Dame game, and they couldn't win it. And you're right, Missouri's finding ways to win,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in a close game, it'll find a way to win against Texas A&M.
All right, so we're in lockstep on that one. How about Auburn at Georgia? Two teams we've discussed a lot today. Georgia, apparently the sports books were watching the fourth quarter of that game and not the first three, or maybe they've just been watching Auburn all season long, because Georgia is a 23.5-point favorite at home. I'm actually going to take Auburn and the points in this one, John. I think Georgia wins comfortably, maybe about a 21 point margin. I don't think they're threatened with what would be a disastrous loss, but I think Auburn's defense is good enough, and Georgia's offense hasn't quite showed me enough yet to cover a spread this big. So I will take Auburn in the 23.5 points.
Yeah, I think Georgia. I don't know if it'll have a letdown after the Alabama game, but sometimes when a team is not faring well, it does better on the road, and I'm referring to Auburn in that case. It maybe just being away from where all its fans are and where it's taking a lot of heat for disappointing losses at home. That loss to Cal was an awful loss to have on your resume. So I also agree with you on Georgia's offense. It just doesn't. I just can't see it scoring an overwhelming victory. We're just going running up and down the field, piling up the points. I don't see that. So I'll take those points too.
All right, I've already tipped my hand at South Carolina, John. The line I'm looking at, Ole Miss 9.5-point favorite. That's an early in the week line, but that's when I set the lines for this podcast. So be it. Ole Miss 9.5-point favorite. I am without hesitation taking the 9.5 points in South Carolina, which probably means Ole Miss will rout the Gamecocks. But hey, the way I've been going this year, can do no wrong. I just think because the matchup we talked about earlier, John, some concerns about Ole Miss's physicality and that being the strength of South Carolina, their defensive front. I think they could give Ole Miss a lot of problems in this game. And if Ole Miss can't get that tempo offense humming, they look a little bit differently. So I think Ole Miss will find a way to win, but I think it'll be close. I think 9.5 is plenty of points. So I'll take the home team, the Gamecocks, and pocket those 9.5 points.
That makes very good sense, but I'm going the other way. I guess I want to still believe I was right about Ole Miss, that it really is a good team because first few weeks, my theory was take Texas, Ole Miss, and Tennessee and give the points.
Yep.
And didn't work out, given Kentucky 17.5 points did it. So I just have a hard time. I watched South Carolina struggle to beat Old Dominion. I just can't quite shake that game. So I'm going to go with your pick is more logical, but I'm going the other way, and I'm going to take Ole Miss.
I knew that Old Dominion would just be rooted in there for you, John. We'll see if South Carolina reworks your perception of them this week. Our perception remains pretty lofty of Tennessee, maybe higher than it's really been at any point in the season. They had a bye week to prepare for Arkansas. It's on the road. We've seen Tennessee kind of squander opportunities on the road in past seasons. I think this team is differently because I think it's different because it's got a defense that I think travels better than its past defenses did. Tennessee, a 13.5-point favorite on the road at Arkansas. All Josh Heupel does is cover spreads and win football games. John, he doesn't just win; he wins with enough points to make folks that bet on the Vols pretty happy more times than not. So I think the 13.5 is key on this one. I'd be a little bit more worried if it was 14.5, but only needing to win by 14. I'm taking Tennessee to cover the spread.
I agree, and it's because of Tennessee's defense. Its stats are inflated because of the schedule it's played. Every FBS team it's played ranks 100th or worse in total offense. So it's, but having played Tennessee has affected those averages. Uh, Arkansas is much improved over last year statistically. Uh, it's moving the ball effectively. Its passing yards, its passing game doesn't look as good as the yardage total does at the end of the day. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe because Taylor Green is not very accurate. He's got a strong arm. I just don't think Arkansas is ready for Tennessee's defensive front.
Mm-hmm.
Most teams aren't, and I think Tennessee's defensive front will dominate the game and cover the spread.
John, we were talking in the preseason. We got one more game to pick and then our lock, but I want to take a moment here on Arkansas because we were talking in the preseason about how Billy Napier and Sam Pittman were facing the most heat coming into this year, and that's come to fruition with Billy Napier. But I thought Arkansas, even though they lost to Texas A&M, I thought that it was a really important road win a couple of weeks ago against. They're sitting at 3-3. They could lose this one. They'd be or they're 3-2 right now. If they lose this one, they're 3-3. Then they have LSU and Mississippi State. I don't think they're going to lose to Mississippi State. So at worst, Sam Pittman at that juncture of the season would be 4-4. He still has Louisiana Tech on the schedule, and he's got some tough games mixed in there with Ole Miss, Texas, at Missouri. I think Sam Pittman might survive this season, John. If he can get to 6-6, because he's got that stipulation into his contract where the worse his record gets, then that unlocks a discounted buyout for Arkansas. But he's stayed above float. He's not unlocked that discounted buyout yet. And so if he can beat Mississippi State, beat Louisiana Tech, find one somewhere else, get to 6-6, I know that's not a season where you're popping discounted sparkling wine in Fayetteville that you bought up at the Walmart, but I don't know that it's enough to get Sam Pittman fired. I think he could survive into next year. What are your thoughts? Does he make it to next season, or does it get bad enough this year where they make a move on Pittman?
Well, I think it depends on how seriously Arkansas takes its football program.
Mm.
To me, Arkansas has to make a change. It's going to be mediocre at best under Sam Pittman. We've got a track record now. It's been dreadful in close games. I think it's 6-16 in games decided by 8 points or fewer. I just think Arkansas has to make a change. I don't see this its program certainly turning a corner and having some meteoric rise. And I don't think he will beat any of those. You're trying to find another win for him.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't see it. In fact, I'm not even sure he can beat Mississippi State.
You
As
think more
bad as
highly
it
of
is.
Mississippi State than I do.
I know.
Yeah, I don't
But
think he survives 5-7. So if he doesn't find that extra one in there, I think he probably goes. And I do think, like, the old thought used to be if a coach is likable, that buys them on those kind of borderline scenarios, that buys them another year. I don't know if that still exists at many places now, but I do think to the extent that it does, it's helped Sam Pittman at Arkansas. I think that administration, that fan base, they want him to succeed there. At some point, if it's not going to happen, you have to admit it and face the music and move on. I think if he doesn't find a 6th win, it definitely moves on. Whether it moves on otherwise, I'm not sure. All right, one more game and then our lock. John, Billy Napier, if he loses at home to UCF, I think it's probably curtains for him right then and there on some. UCF coming to town, Florida 1-point favorite. I've been burned by the Gators before, John, but I'm going to the well. What the heck? One more time with buyout Billy. Sunbelt Billy. I'm going to trust him to make it through one more week. UCF looked awful while losing to Coach Prime. So I'm going to do it one more time, John. I'm going to take Florida at the Swamp to win, to cover the 1 point, and taking the Gators.
Yeah, I was all prepared to pick UCF, which has the second best running game in the country. Couldn't tell it against Colorado. I think it had about 170 yards rushing. Uh, Florida has been poor against the run. So just looking at that stat alone, I was prepared to pick. I was prepared to pick UCF to win a close game in the swamp. But after seeing the Colorado result, uh, horrible pass defense by UCF, and has been throwing it pretty well. I think it was it was like 26-28 or something against Mississippi State. So I'll go with the Gators, but not with much conviction. Will Billy Napier keep playing both quarterbacks? Is that his grand plan? Do you
Uh,
think?
Maybe whatever the boosters tell him to do, because I'm not sure it really matters for his future at this point. I feel like his fate's kind of sealed. But I mean, I think if there's any chance of saving his job, John, I think he has to play both quarterbacks. I don't see how you could park DJ Lagway on the bench and make an argument to the future. But uh, if you need to survive till next year, you might need to play Graham Mertz too. I mean, the last time we saw Graham Mertz, he was going for 19 of 21 against Mississippi State for 3 touchdowns, and Lagway played well in that game too. Both quarterbacks played well, so I really think the sliver of a hope that Billy Napier maybe has of running this out for a while probably involves both quarterbacks not only playing but playing and looking good, and trying to trumpet the message of, hey, I got this thing figured out now. Now I don't know that anyone's going to believe him, but maybe they'll let him man the fort for a couple more weeks anyway.
Do you think if he lost to UCF, he would lose his job? Did Florida would go ahead and make a move?
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't think you get to lose to Miami at home, to UCF at home, and get to coach another week at
W-
Florida. Yes,
Okay, well, let's go a little bit further then. Do you think if he beats UCF but then lost to Tennessee and Kentucky, do you think
yes.
he would make okay?
I think
So
we make it.
we're just we're just gonna every game his job is hanging in the balance, is what you're saying.
I think it probably is at this point, unless Florida rattles off 3 straight, beats UCF, beats Tennessee on the road, beats Kentucky. Then I think, yeah, maybe he buys himself uh, a whiff of breathing room. Oh, but then he closes the season
Yeah,
against Georgia, Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, Florida State. Sayonara, Billy. I mean, this ends with Billy Napier getting fired, and that's why I think we're all in the camp of when,
yes.
not if. All right, our locks of the week, John. They have been exactly that, a lock this year. Clemson has. I left them for dead after week 1. John had poor Dabo had him buried, but in our role, uh, neither one of us are afraid to resurrect somebody. And I've resurrected Clemson, and I've buried Florida State. It's at Florida State. Who cares? Because nobody's going to be at the game. Florida State fans have moved on past this season. Clemson is a 13.5-point favorite. I'm not convinced. I know Florida State fans don't care about this season anymore. I'm not convinced the Florida State players care about this season anymore. I do think Dabo's got his guys caring about this season. So I think Clemson wins and covers the 13.5 points in what will be a fairly empty stadium in Tallahassee, I think.
Yeah, I looked at that game, and that's a great pick. Uh, we shouldn't be picking the same one, so I'll leave that alone. Uh, I'll go or my lock. I'll go, and also thanks to shout out to Kent State
Mm-hmm.
last week, which I pretty much all the years I've been watching football, it's as bad as any college football team I've ever seen, and saw it lose to Tennessee 71-0. And then the next week, it lost 56-0 to Penn State and lost both its first string and second string quarterback for the year to injuries. So it comes out with a third stringer against Eastern Michigan and as a 14-point underdog and loses by much more than 14. I didn't even have to sweat that when Eastern Michigan had 52 points. So I guess I just want to I know not anybody saying anything on behalf of the Golden Flashes, but I just want to give them a shout out and say, hey, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
I'm
Uh,
wondering who Kent State plays this week, John, and I feel like I'm about to find out. Except, oh no, wait, bye week. So I'll find out who they're
No,
playing on
you
October
would have
12th.
found out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty much etched in stone. No, we will not be. Uh, Trust me, I was very saddened when I saw that schedule because that's something I don't even have to think about. That's just automatic. If this happens, you do this. If Kent State's playing, you pick against it. It's as
Yes.
simple as that. So I'll have to go to something more difficult, more challenging. I'll take a late night. I think it's a late night game. I'll take Arizona -5.5. Is the line I had against Texas Tech.
Yeah, it is 5.5. So you're taking Arizona to cover the 5.5. You're still obsessed with Arizona. You love Noah Fafita. I know
Yeah,
you
I
had the
do. He
yeah.
made a great throw on the dead run last week against Utah for a touchdown. Hit a guy deep in the end zone in stride. I really like that guy. He's got a great receiver. Can't pronounce his first name. McMillan's his last one. So yeah, I'm going with Arizona. Texas Tech has a really porous defense. Arizona has a better defense. And Texas Tech can definitely put some points on the board. So I'll give that 5.5. And still saddened by Kent State not playing. That would have been an easy choice.
All right. Well, we'll get to find out who Kent State is playing next week on SEC Football Unfiltered, and we'll get to find out whether Billy Napier and Hugh Freeze get to keep their jobs for another week as well. We'll hope you come by and see us next week. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.